In particular, I want to thank His Holiness Pope Francis.
President Obama cites the Holy Father in moving to normalize relations with Cuba after the release of an American citizen. Religious freedom fight. A UK High Court rules Catholic midwives trained to deliver babies must assist with abortions. Displays of faith. How do Americans feel about religious displays in the public square? And birthday wishes in all languages for Pope Francis as he celebrates his 78th. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, December 17th, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. In a historic shift, President Obama moves to end the U.S. standoff with Cuba, a policy he says has failed to advance U.S. interests. Chief White House correspondent Suzanne LaFranchi has more from the White House.
Brian, the president's plan included year-long secret negotiations and the personal involvement of Pope Francis. The deal calls for expanding economic ties, the opening of an embassy, and reconsidering Cuba's designation as a terror state. Bells ring in Havana, hailing the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba today.
His Holiness Pope Francis issued a personal appeal to me and to Cuba's President Raul Castro. I believe that we can do more to support the Cuban people and promote our values through engagement.
In a statement, the Vatican said Pope Francis wishes to express his warm congratulations for the efforts taken by Cuba and the U.S. with the aim of overcoming, in the interest of the citizens of both countries, the difficulties which have marked their recent history. As Obama spoke to Americans, Cuban President Raul Castro addressed his own nation from Havana, where he thanked the president and the church. Some on Capitol Hill, like first-generation Cuban-American Senator Marco Rubio, vehemently opposed the executive action.
What these changes are going to do is they will tighten this regime's grip on power for decades to come.
Mike Gonzalez, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a Cuban-American, says Obama has thrown a lifeline to the communist regime, who no longer has the Soviet Union or Venezuelan oil money.
So the Cuban regime will now use the money from American tourists and from American transactions and from bad corporations that invest money in Cuba to keep itself alive and to continue to oppress the Cuban people.
Gonzalez, once an altar boy in Cuba, says Catholics there face harsh discrimination.
I like to see Pope Francis act now as forcefully in freeing the Cuban people, the vast majority of whom are Catholics, as he has acted with Obama in trying to get the embargo lifted.
Both Pope John Paul II and Benedict visited the communist nation. Another key detail, attempts to lift the economic embargo will take an act of Congress. Brian?
Suzanne, thanks for reporting from the White House. And Cuba's release of American prisoner Alan Gross actually set the stage for this diplomatic breakthrough. He says he's thankful for his freedom and harbors no ill will to the Cuban people.
To me, Cubanos, or at least most of them, are incredibly kind, generous, and talented. It pains me to see them treated so unjustly as a consequence of two governments' mutually belligerent policies.
Cuba accused Gross of trying to undermine its government. He worked on the island as an international development contractor and has been imprisoned for 5 years. The Beckett Fund's Kristina Arriaga is a former Cuban expert for the UN Human Rights Commission, worked also directly to release political prisoners from Cuba. In your opinion, is today's agreement good or bad for Cubans?
It depends. It depends, but what's going to happen will make an enormous difference for the people of Cuba, and it will go one way or the other. One way is 50 more years of misery for the people of Cuba, and the other is freedom for the people of Cuba that have been oppressed for 54 years.
The Vatican has been very directly involved in this, and it didn't just start with Pope Francis. It really goes back to John Paul II, was picked up by Benedict XVI. Why, after all these years of oppression of Catholics, would the Church become the intermediary here?
Well, all Cuban Americans, like me and my family, we were very excited when John Paul II went to Cuba, because John Paul II had been able to change everything in Poland for the good, and that country had been able to rid itself from communism. But I think that the Vatican did not realize at the time that Cuba as an island was very isolated and had absolutely no support from democracies that surrounded it. Benedict and as well as Pope Francis have had a unique understanding of the very complex dynamics of the government of Cuba. But the fact is that all liberties go together. So unless the people of Cuba are able to get economic liberty at the same time they get freedom of religion and freedom of speech, this is not going to work out.
I wonder if you agree or disagree with your colleague from the Heritage Foundation who says now is the time for Pope Francis to step up and say, okay, we've got this far, now let Catholics be Catholics.
Well, yes and no. I mean, Pope Francis was able to crack the door open and have the U.S. government, the most powerful government in the world, step in. It is now time for the Obama administration to not make any more concessions unless the people, the government of Castro, the Castro thugs, allow Catholics to live a Catholic life in Cuba. This is not up to the Pope. This is up to the Obama administration and the Castro government.
And until that visit by John Paul II, even Christmas was outlawed in Cuba. Of course, Christmas can now be celebrated. I'm sure there are restrictions. As this holiday approaches, what can we do as America and Americans to ensure that Cubans get the right to religious freedom?
I say that we should remind our government that the Castro regime has to have its feet to the fire, that the government cannot make any more concessions until the Castros liberate people entirely, not only in here, but outside, so they're free in Cuba to truly profess their faith.
Do you think Juan Castro is open to this?
I don't think that. I think Castro is desperate right now. I think it's a great time to negotiate with him. Most Cubans live below the poverty line. Things in Cuba are terrible. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom to write. There's no artistic freedom. And I think that Castro is feeling the pressure from his own people and from the external circumstances that have made this economy be so poor and so difficult for the Cuban people. It's a great time to negotiate, and I hope that the Obama administration takes great advantage of it.
We pray this will be a good Christmas for our Cuban brothers and sisters, and the new year will be even better. Kristina Arriaga with the Becket Foundation, the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. We should stress that the Becket Fund represents EWTN. We always appreciate you being here.
Thank you. It's great being back, Brian.
Thank you. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. The UK's highest court is ruling 2 Catholic midwives do not have the right to refuse to assist with abortions. Mary Dugan and Connie Wood are senior midwives in Glasgow, Scotland. They argue supervising abortions violates their conscience, but the UK Supreme Court rejected their case today. The Society for the Protection of Unborn Children says this means midwives who refuse to kill babies may be forced out of their profession. The Bishop of Paisley, Scotland, commended the 2 women and their fight for life in the courts.
By making this simple stance a number of years ago in the back rooms of their hospital, they are now UK-wide news. And that's a good example to all of us, that take your Catholic principles proudly into the workplace, they're also the best for humanity, and then let the good Lord do the rest.
Bishop John Keenan says the freedom of conscience has been eroding in the UK. He hopes today's ruling will actually spark a revitalized pro-life movement there. Pope Francis prays for the victims of the terrorist acts recently in Pakistan, Australia, and Yemen, calling for the terrorist conversion.
Accolga nella sua pace I defunti, conforti I familiari e converta.
Pope Francis asking the Lord to welcome the deceased in his peace, comfort their family members, and change the hearts of those who won't even spare children. Well, Pope Francis has named 9 new members to the Vatican Commission for the Protection of Minors. They come from diverse backgrounds. There are now 17 members of that commission, including some psychologists and health professionals. More than half of the commission members are women. The new members announced today include a second abuse victim who has been critical of the church. The commission meets next February 6th through the 8th at the Vatican. There's a celebration in Rome today. It is the Pope's birthday. Alan Holdren joined thousands in St. Peter's Square in wishing the Holy Father happy birthday.
A beautiful December day in Rome. It's also a special one for the Vicar of Christ. Pope Francis turns 78 today. Some already knew about it and came prepared to the general audience. Others didn't, but were just as happy to join in.
I didn't know it was his birthday. I'm like shivering. I've got tingles from this. It's so cool.
We wish him happy birthday and all good things happen to him.
Well, I wish him a good day, first of all, but most of all, he gets filled with the Holy Spirit today and just really blesses everyone as he continues to do every day so far.
Among those present, a group of tango dancers, there to help Francis celebrate. The Pope was expecting them.
He knows because he told us several times he say hello to us today.
Tangueros, they're called in Spanish. Pope Francis has said he loves the Argentine dance, and so do these folks, gathered for his birthday for a post-audience flash mob outside the square, adding to the festivities for a once-a-year occasion.
Happy birthday, Pope Francis. Thank you very much for your life and for the gift that you are for the church and for the world.
Feliz cumple.
In Rome, Alan Holdren, EWTN News Nightly.
Dr. Samuel Gregg with the Acton Institute joining us by Skype from Ann Arbor to talk about our Pope on his birthday. Pope Francis is the first Latin American Pope, specifically from Argentina. How do you think that shapes his worldviews and his way of communication?
Well, in a couple of ways, Brian. First of all, it's necessary to understand that Argentina has a very tragic history in the 20th century, highly polarized society between left and right. It's an economic disaster. But this is a pope also who has not spent a lot of time outside Argentina, so this is bound to affect the way that he looks at the world. And I think it shows that he's very concerned for the peripheries. I think it shows that when it comes to Argentina, he just doesn't project the specific Argentine experience upon the rest of the world. But it's very clear that some of the concerns that he brings from Latin America, which is where most of the world's Catholics live, at least a plurality of them now, he brings that experience to the papacy in a way that no other pope ever has.
And he's very candid in the way he talks, almost chatty. Is that part of what it is to be like from Argentina?
Well, I've spent some time in Argentina, and Argentina is like any other country. There are chatty people and there are people who are more formal. But I think what the then Cardinal Bergoglio was emphasizing was the need for church leaders to be able to talk to ordinary people. And that's not always something that we see with some of our leaders, but he's very, very good at doing that because he wants to communicate with those people who he wants to bring back to the life of the church. And that's part of what I think he's trying to do as Pope. The question is whether those people will just stay on the margins and feel like they're affirmed, or whether they'll answer the call to conversion, which is the very point of going to the margins in the first place.
Very quickly, has he changed much since becoming Pope after being Archbishop?
Well, I think it's true to say that when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was relatively restrained. He wasn't in the public eye very much. He was very careful about what he said. But now, of course, he's on a different stage. He's on a global stage, and the stage that he has to talk to is one that goes far beyond Argentina and Latin America. And so I think it's true to say that, as he himself has said, that after becoming Pope, his entire demeanor has changed. So we'll see how the two things fit together, whether the Argentine experience in that regard will somehow either be magnified through this global voice that he has now, or whether we'll see a more reserved Bergoglio emerge later in this pontificate or not. It's very difficult to say, but what is clear is that Argentines themselves will tell you that this Pope was a very different man in Buenos Aires, and I think we'll see in later years exactly how that plays out.
Dr. Samuel Gregg with the Acton Institute, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Coming up, a priest who has worked in Pakistan for 30 years reacts to the tragic loss of life at the hands of terrorists. And we have results of a survey of Americans' attitudes about religious displays on government property. On Wednesday evening, December 17th, thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Congress has approved a last-minute tax package extending expired tax breaks through the end of the year. The president is expected to sign it. Some banks, retailers, commuters, teachers, and others can still claim certain tax breaks on their 2014 tax returns. Well, President Obama has now signed the $1.1 trillion spending bill that Congress finally passed over the weekend. It keeps the federal government running for the next 9 months. Immigration enforcement under the Department of Homeland Security is only funded, though, through February 27th. People around the world are mourning the tragedy in Pakistan that left 140-some children dead. Father Robert McCullough spent more than 30 years there working in healthcare and education. He shared his thoughts with our Rome correspondent Alan Holdren earlier today.
Father McCullough, the Taliban has attacked a school in Pakistan, killing more than 140 people there, including many children. What does this attack say about the Taliban's presence there in Pakistan?
To me, it represents a statement that the Taliban are under threat in Pakistan. Remember, it's an attack on a school where the children in the military were being educated, and it was a deliberately, as I see it, a deliberate retaliation against the military. There's no underestimating the level of the intensity and the presence of the Taliban in the country, but it's in a sense of conflict now, and I think this action has certainly turned public opinion, even political opinion, well and truly against the stance of the Taliban in the country.
And the Prime Minister has called this a national tragedy. He's called for 3 days of mourning. Numerous world leaders have decried this. Also, the Taliban in Afghanistan has done so. What does this say about the Taliban, the difference between the Taliban and Afghanistan and Pakistan?
They are separate organizations, and there has been, in the last 5 years, a major dysfunction in organization and connection between the two organizations. To use the term Taliban as just a generic term really doesn't describe the geopolitical situation and the religious affiliations that you've got going on there. Pakistan Taliban, of course, is focused on Kashmir as well, and that doesn't enter into the agenda of the Taliban of Afghanistan.
And in Pakistan, and unfortunately in Afghanistan as well, people are used to this violence. What do you see is the impact of this particular attack on the school? What impact will this have on Pakistani life?
Horror. I think it's actually going to link in very much with the event that happened some 4 weeks ago when a Christian couple, the woman being pregnant, were beaten up and thrown alive into the furnace of a brick kiln. They were really, if I can use the phrase, they were Auschwitzed. That raised an intense level of horror and anger in Pakistan, and I think this is going to cement the emerging feeling in Pakistan that this has nothing to do with what we should be doing as believers or as Pakistanis.
Thank you so much, Father.
You're welcome.
Very powerful. Well, here in America, how do Americans feel about religious displays on public property? A new survey shows most are okay with nativity scenes or menorahs on government sites. Wyatt Goolsby reports.
As displays pop up during the holiday season, Americans debate whether religious symbols should be allowed in the public square. This year, some have argued against nativity scenes in parts of Virginia, Arkansas, and Texas. Officials have not been forced to remove those displays, but a new Pew survey shows most Americans say religious symbols should be allowed on government property. 44% say Christian symbols should be allowed on government property regardless of any other displays. 28% say Christian symbols should only be displayed alongside other religious symbols, and 20% say no religious symbols should be on government property at all. Jessica Martinez researches religious topics for Pew.
Catholics overall closely resemble the general public on this matter, but evangelical Protestants are somewhat more likely than Catholics to say Christian symbols are okay whether or not there are other symbols allowed. And sort of on the other side, those who have no religious affiliation are somewhat more likely than Catholics to say that no religious symbols should be displayed at all.
Bill Donahue with the Catholic League has been drawing attention to what he calls the war on Christmas for decades. He says there are still efforts to remove all Christian symbols from taxpayer property, but he credits individual citizens for pushing back.
Now what we've seen over the last, I'd say, 8 or 9 years, where things have turned around a little bit, is that people are taking it upon themselves. They're going to their school board. They're going to their city council. They're buying the creches and asked to be put up in public forum.
Opponents argue religious displays make it appear the government favors specific faiths, and that continues to stir debate.
Several groups here in Washington have also voiced their concern over religious displays. The American Humanist Association recently sent out a letter to county officials in Rusk, Texas, asking them to remove their courthouse nativity scene, which they say is against the First Amendment. That display and several others across the country have not been removed. Brian.
All right, thank you, Wyatt. Up next, we'll tell you how our Jewish brothers and sisters are celebrating Hanukkah and show you more of the spontaneous dance party that erupted in St. Peter's Square today for the Pope's birthday. We're celebrating the 78th birthday of Pope Francis today. Look at this photo posted on the Vatican News Facebook page. A young Jorge Bergoglio cutting a slice of cake for his beloved grandmother, Nonna Rosa. He carries a letter that she gave him at his ordination in his breviary. And Pope Francis has been marking his birthday, sharing lunch with the poor in the Domo Santa Marta, where he lives. Thanks for joining us on the 17th of December. I'm Brian Patrick. We're joined by Rabbi Charles Feinberg from Addis Israel Congregation. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you so much.
Share the significance of this celebration with us.
Hanukkah is a celebration of a historical event that occurred in the 2nd century BCE, a victory of the few over the many by a group led by the Maccabees, or a group of priests who felt disenfranchised. And it's a struggle over, it was a struggle over the soul of the Jewish people, whether they would give in to forces of assimilation to Greek culture, or they would observe the traditions of the Torah, of the Jewish scripture.
So you celebrate for 8 days.
We do.
What typically goes on? This is a home celebration mainly, right?
Yes, it is. And so one of the symbols of the holiday is a Hanukkah menorah, a lamp. Each night we light a candle or oil in the lamp, so that by the 8th night we have 8 candles plus one more lit. So that's the major ritual part of the celebration. There are certain foods that we eat. Usually it's a celebration of oil, and so fried foods.
Good food.
Right. Potato pancakes.
Oh,
if you're from Eastern Europe, if our
Yes.
ancestries, and if you're from the Middle East, jelly donuts.
Sounds very good. Do you give and receive gifts?
We do a bit. I would say more in America than in other cultures because of the influence of Christmas and gift giving then. Traditionally, Eastern European Jews used to give Hanukkah money to children. In the Middle East, it was giving of clothes, actually, to different people. But today, there's a lot of gift giving.
So the Christian festivities around Christmas time and the Jewish Hanukkah often overlap. How can we better appreciate and understand one another's traditions?
Well, one is to understand that Hanukkah is not a major festival in our calendar. It was always de-emphasized in the Jewish tradition, and so to understand that our major holidays actually are in the fall, with the Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement, as well as in the spring with the holiday of Passover and the Passover Seder, a meal that is celebrated at home.
So we shouldn't confuse Hanukkah with Christmas,
right.
because
It
Christmas
doesn't
is
have
a
this,
major celebration.
It doesn't have the same significance in the Jewish tradition as Christmas does in the Christian tradition.
What would you say is the main Jewish holiday then? Yom Kippur?
The main holidays are the ones I mentioned, plus the Sabbath. We believe that the Sabbath actually is the holiest day. And so every Saturday is considered a festival as well.
Well, we believe the same, except it's Sunday.
I understand.
We celebrate the resurrection every
that.
single Sunday.
Right, that's right.
So there's certainly something that we can connect on, and we appreciate you sharing that tradition with us, Rabbi, and thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank
Happy
you,
Hanukkah.
and Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you. Well, our EWTN News Nightly team invites you to pray with us for our Holy Father today on his 78th birthday and certainly every day of the year. We invite you to join our papal prayer campaign. Tell your friends and family to do the same. You can use the hashtag Pope Francis to spread the word on Twitter, and you can also send prayers to us at newsplanning@ewtn.com. We will share some of your prayers with all of us later this week. I want to thank you for watching tonight, and we leave you with more of today's birthday celebration for Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square. Good night, and may God bless you.